Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere. As you probably have guessed, I'm your host, Connor Jones, and I'm here this week to share with you another story that comes from just about as close as you can get to the middle of nowhere, that is Poverty Flats, Wyoming. But first, a message from our sponsors. This week's episode is sponsored by Basins Market in Basin, Wyoming. Basins Market is your destination for groceries, fresh produce, and the best meat department in the Bighorn Basin. Come on in and sample their wide selection of products, whether you're driving up north to go through the Bighorns to the Black Hills or driving down south on your way to Thermopolis. They are open Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. and Sundays from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. We're also sponsored by our friends at the Wyoming Welcome Program. The Wyoming Welcome Program offers both Table Talk brochures and Wyoming Welcome baskets. The brochures are placed on restaurant tables throughout Cody and Powell, and they feature jokes, facts about Wyoming, and the month's holidays. In addition to this, they include sponsors from various businesses throughout the Bighorn Basin. Their baskets include advertisements, coupons, and goodies from local businesses, and they're distributed to newcomers to the Park County area. So if you're a small business owner and you'd like to get your name out there, contact them at Haley J, that's HALEYJ, at WyomingWelcome.com. And now, the podcast. This one is about Southern California, actually. If you don't know, I served a mission as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for 2 years in Southern California in the California Riverside Mission. So I have a special spot in my heart for the people of Southern California, especially those who speak Spanish. That's where I learned to speak Spanish, and there are some fantastic Latter-day Saints in Southern California. And lots of other great people too, not just members of my church. I will say, California is a fun place to visit, but I don't intend to live there for any length of time again. I don't know, lots of people, just so many people, and the air quality always got to me, which is interesting for me to worry about or consider to be a downside to living in California, because the air quality wasn't very good when I got home from my mission. I was expecting to see for miles in Wyoming, but when I got home, there were a lot of forest fires, and it was so smoky. I remember how sad I was that I couldn't see the Bighorns from my house when I got home. And speaking of fires, there is a huge fire on the Sheridan side of the Bighorn Mountains right now, and we're all praying that we can get some moisture and that they'll be able to put the fire out. So hopefully by the time you hear the next episode, I can report on an extinguished elk fire over there in Sheridan. And we're praying for all the firefighters and for those who live in the path of that fire. So we hope it is put out soon, can be extinguished. But let's go ahead and move on. We're going to talk about hiking, of all things, in Southern California. And this story is called When They Were Up, They Were Up. Here goes. Anyone who has served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints stateside can tell you that it comes with a host of benefits and challenges that are unique to serving in the United States. For instance, you're just about guaranteed to have running water and electricity, which are luxuries in many other countries. I have friends who served missions in places like Africa, South America, and the Pacific Islands, and they report washing their clothes by hand suffering through sweltering heat with no air conditioning, and showering with a bucket. While serving as a missionary in Southern California, I enjoyed all the comforts of living in a first world country. But while I could always count on reliable power and water, I also had other challenges to face. Let me just say the members of the church where I served were wonderful. Some of the best people on this planet live in Riverside County, California, and I was incredibly blessed to serve among such wonderful Latter-day Saints. There were many times when members of the church put aside time to come join us, to meet with friends not of our faith, members who gave us a ride in their personal vehicles or sent a picture of us home to our parents with a friendly update on how we were doing. In addition to this, one of the favorite means of assisting missionaries among Latter-day Saints in SoCal and throughout the U.S. was by feeding them. A lot. I know it isn't the case in every mission in the United States, but us missionaries in Riverside could count on eating dinner in the home of one of the members of the church every single night. During the course of 2 years, I can count on one hand the number of times I had to cook dinner for myself. Eating in the homes of members was often the highlight of my day, especially in areas where people were less than receptive to our message. It was wonderful getting to sit down with fellow believers and break bread, and the homes of members of the church were safe havens in a world that could otherwise be pretty hostile. I will forever be grateful to all those who made home-cooked meals and for the friendship of good people. Now, one unintended consequence of being a dinner guest each night is that missionaries generally bulk up on stateside missions, not unlike a black bear getting ready for hibernation. If missionaries don't follow the counsel of mission leaders and exercise regularly, this is especially true. In fact, even though I continue to exercise for an hour every day as a missionary, I also gained around 20 pounds. Hispanic food is my favorite, and I pounded plate after plate of enchiladas, tacos, pupusas, tortas, flautas, sopes, quesadillas, mole, and tortillas, not to mention tamales. Fat and happy is probably a pretty good description, if you know what I mean. My weight gain aside, I dealt with what I considered to be the real difficulty associated with serving in Southern California: the lack of wilderness. No matter where I went, I was surrounded by civilization. Buildings, people, roads, and vehicles absolutely cover Southern California. In fact, California is the most populous state in the Union, with nearly 39 million residents. Wyoming is the least populated, with less than 600,000. This small-town Wyoming boy literally went from the middle of nowhere to one of the largest population centers in the world, and boy did I miss wide-open spaces. Growing up in northwestern Wyoming, I was used to being surrounded by mountains, not people. I could walk out my back door and on a busy day see 2 human beings. In California, I was lucky if I could walk out of my apartment and see fewer than 200. There were mountains, but they were far to the east and outside the limited area where I was permitted to go. I was starved for a taste of the outdoors and some cool mountain air. And on Mondays, when we had a few hours to explore, I dragged my fellow missionaries out to the most remote places I could find in an effort to scratch my itch for the outdoors. One Monday, we went fishing at a man-made stream in a trailer park. I caught a perch in the first 15 minutes or so, and I really wish I had taken a picture with it, because it turned out that fish would come to represent all we caught between 6 guys in 2 hours. Another time, we hiked the famous Mount Rubidoux. The mount part turned out to be an exaggeration, since the little hill was about 500 feet tall, and on top of that, it was paved all the way to the top. Smog smothered the view, but at least we had climbed something. Once in Corona, California, we climbed into the hills south of the city. It was a pretty respectable hike once we got past the neighborhood. For us Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho boys, it almost felt like we were in the wilderness. Until we turned around and saw the 8-lane highway with its endless rows of traffic and a sprawl of buildings. In Southern California, there's just no escaping the city for a missionary. Of all the hikes I went on during my 2 years in California, though, one stands out amid the rest. I was in my second area in downtown Riverside, and I lived near the University of California Riverside campus. To the east of downtown Riverside stands Box Springs Mountain, and high up its side, a massive 132-foot concrete sea poured in the 1950s gives a nod to the college below. Naturally, the Boy Scout within me was determined to make the climb up to the sea. So, one Monday morning, my missionary companion and I set out with 4 other missionaries I had invited from our zone to make the climb. At the time, my companion was Elder Sykes from Brigham City, Utah. He was tall and powerfully built, had played football in high school, and spent his summers pouring asphalt with his father's construction company. The other 4 missionaries included Elder Feldman, Elder Warren, Elder Morton, and Elder Chung. Elder Morton and Elder Chung were Chinese-speaking missionaries who covered the UCR campus, where a high percentage of the students speak Chinese. Elder Morton was a cross-country runner and had competed in a couple Spartan races in Utah, while his companion was from mainland China. Though slightly built, Elder Chung had little to no experience hiking, having been raised in an enormous city whose name I struggle to pronounce. Feldman and Warren served in the Arlington Heights area of Riverside. Elder Warren was from Meridian, Idaho, and had a scholarship to play lacrosse in college waiting for him when he returned from his mission. Of all the missionaries in our party, Elder Feldman was probably the most colorful. He had completed basic training for the Navy shortly before entering the mission field, and he was as tough and pugnacious as they come. He wasn't one to back down from a challenge, and he was always ready to laugh or fight, and not necessarily in that order. When he emerged from basic training, he was in peak physical condition, but Southern California's hospitality had taken its toll on Elder Feldman. I didn't know him at the start of the mission, but my understanding is there was a lot less of him to know when he first arrived in California. By the time of our hike, he had definitely put on a few pounds, and he was no longer in fighting form. Then again, none of us really were. I'm sure we had been a lot less active since becoming missionaries. It's unavoidable. Church meetings replace sporting events, and scripture study replaces early morning workouts. Though we still had at least a half hour to exercise each day, none of us were getting in the hours of exercise we were accustomed to. Before I came to California, I was farming and spent 10 or 12 hours a day moving pipe, cleaning corrals, and fixing fence. Soon after arriving in California, I had to visit the doctor's office. While there, the nurse checked my vitals as per usual, but when she got to my heart rate, a very discernible frown crossed her face, and she shook her watch a couple of times before pressing her fingers to my wrist a second time. I was getting a little concerned now, since it's never a good thing when a member of the medical profession frowns at you, and even less so when the frown is associated with the performance of your heart. Finally, the nurse said, "Do you, work out a bunch?" I raised my eyebrows. Yeah, I guess so," I said. "Well, that must explain it. Your heart rate is a 55. "Oh," I nodded. "Yeah, I'm pretty active." I didn't mention I had also recently moved from an elevation of 4,500 feet down to practically sea level, which I'm sure played a role in my low resting heart rate. Now, 6 months into the mission, I definitely wasn't in the same condition I had been in back home, but I still ran on a regular basis, and I was sure the hike wouldn't be too hard. Heck, it was a mere warm-up compared to the mountains Dad and Scoutmaster Lyman had dragged us up in Wyoming. So it was that one Monday morning, the six of us drove in a couple little Toyota Corollas up to the dusty parking area where the trail began for the hike to the sea. When we stopped, the sun was well over the top of Box Springs Mountain, and it was shaping up to be quite a warm day. I wondered if we should have brought some water with us as we clambered out of the car and stretched. Garbage littered the ground, ranging from plastic grocery sacks to soda bottles and beer cans. There's no escaping the human touch in SoCal, and I shook my head as I surveyed the mess, wishing I had come prepared with a garbage sack. "You guys ready for this?" Elder Morton asked, touching his toes with a smooth motion that definitely would have ripped something in the back of my own legs. Elder Warren swung his arms to loosen the muscles and grinned around at all of us. All the missionaries, except myself, were dressed in shorts and t-shirts, their missionary tags affixed to the front with magnet clasps. I wore a t-shirt but had donned a pair of jeans. Experience had taught me that wearing shorts in the outdoors was just asking for trouble, but apparently the others didn't share that opinion. My companion, Elder Sykes, grinned and nodded. "This will be fun, guys." He had one of those disarming smiles that was so big it just about pushed his glasses up his nose. I bent over to tighten my shoelaces, then realized we were missing someone. "Hey, where's Elder Feldman?" The five of us glanced around, looking for the absent missionary, and Elder Feldman's companion, Elder Warren, said, "He's still in the car. Says he would rather take a nap than climb this mountain." I grinned. "Don't worry, I'll get him out." To be honest, I was pretty excited about our little hike. It's not every day as a missionary you get to spend some time in the outdoors rather than talking to every person you meet about the gospel. It was going to be so nice to get away from it all for a few hours and breathe some mountain air. Or at least what passed for mountain air in Riverside. I was sure that with a little coaxing, Elder Feldman would come to see things the same way. When I opened the back door of the little red Corolla, I observed that Elder Feldman had pulled the hood of his sweatshirt down around his eyes so that his face was hidden. "Hi, Elder," I said cheerily. "Buenos dias." "Humph," Elder Feldman replied, exhibiting all the sweetness of a badger with a bellyache. Come on, Elder Feldman. You're going to love this hike. The view from the top will be amazing." I wasn't exactly entirely sure about the validity of that statement, given that the smog was especially thick on that particular Monday morning, but I was sure there would be some sort of view regardless. It certainly wouldn't be tan stucco on identical houses. "I want to sleep," Elder Feldman growled. "You can," I said, "after you climb this hill with us." Elder Feldman sighed. "You're not going to leave me alone, are you, Jonesy?" He pulled down his hood and glared at me, his buzz cut bristling. "I don't plan on it," I smiled. "Let's go. It's only going to get hotter the longer we wait." Grumbling, Elder Feldman slowly pulled himself out of the car and reassembled the pieces one at a time, without anything I would call urgency. "Don't they get up early and exercise in the Navy?" Elder Chung asked. Elder Feldman shot a withering glare at Elder Chung. "Yes, we do. We do PT that would make you girls cry." "Well, then this shouldn't be so bad," Elder Morton smiled. The truth was, in spite of Elder Feldman's tough demeanor, I really liked the guy. I respected him for completing basic training, something I certainly had never done, and I knew that his home life hadn't been ideal. The fact that he was out here dedicating 2 years of his life to sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ was admirable, to say the least. Furthermore, having grown up in a place where physical toughness was highly valued, I appreciated Elder Feldman's attitude most of the time. "All right, enough chit-chat. Let's up this hill," I shouted, raising a fist. Together we turned and began up the trail. In front of us, to the east, the rocky, barren mountain rose from the earth. Box Springs Mountain reaches a height of about 3,000 feet, and the climb before us would constitute about a 2,000-foot elevation gain. Gravelly sand crunched under our tennis shoes as we walked, and dust rose with each step. Elder Sykes carried a small backpack with some water, but otherwise we were not equipped with any real gear. My camera was tucked in one pocket in the hopes I might snap a picture or two when we reached the top. The bone-dry skeletons of bushes lined the path, and boulders dotted the landscape. Most of them sported spray-painted graffiti, ranging from obscene words to the names of the artists. I had seen some pretty interesting graffiti in Southern California, and there was even an enterprising defacer of public property who had mowed the message, "Flat Earth, Google it," in block letters on the back of Mount Rubidoux in one of the sister missionaries' areas. While I appreciated the skill of some of the artists, the vandalism always made me shake my head. I was doing a lot of head shaking this morning as we passed rock after rock that had been tagged. Sometimes the empty spray paint can had been tossed by the rock it had painted. Before long, the trail started to climb and our pace slowed. Elder Morton and I drifted toward the front as the climb grew more taxing, and Elders Sykes, Warren, Chung, and Feldman came along behind us. After climbing a short rise, we came to the train tracks for the Metrolink, and I paused to glance at the sign warning hikers to stay off the tracks. "Think we'll get in trouble for crossing?" I asked. "I doubt it. It looks like plenty of people cross the tracks, and the sign doesn't say we can't," Elder Sykes said. "Okay," I shrugged, and we crossed the tracks, single file. That was when we really started climbing. The grade was fairly steep, and the sand and gravel slid out from under our feet as we made our way up the path that snaked its way up the mountain. More graffiti cheered us on with messages like "Boys" with a Z and "Creep 2012. If I were artistic enough to paint graffiti, I think I would go for something a little more uplifting," I gasped between breaths. "Agreed," Elder Sykes replied. "How about 'Jesus loves you'?" Elder Chung suggested. We all laughed, except for Elder Feldman, who had started to drift behind us and was bent over beside the trail with his hands on his knees. "Elder Feldman," I called back to him. "How are you doing?" "Not great, Jonesy," he barked. "Whose idea was this?" "I think it levels out a bit up here," Elder Warren called back. "You got this." "Don't! Just don't!" Elder Feldman shouted. We nodded and waited for a few minutes for Elder Feldman to catch up. His face was red, and sweat darkened his t-shirt. He was huffing and puffing like he had just ran the 400-meter dash, and his eyes flashed as he trudged up to where we were standing on the trail. "We good to go?" I asked, trying to make my voice sound as neutral as possible. "Yeah, let's do it," Elder Sykes said, his grin lighting up his face. I turned and we continued up the path. The giant concrete sea was just visible off in the distance, but we had at least a half-mile ahead of us, and it was all a steady climb. Aside from the sound of our feet crunching on the mixture of sand and gravel beneath our feet, and our breathing, it was quiet on the mountain. Even the various sounds of the city, like traffic and sirens, were no longer audible. I felt my spirits lifting, and it was as if I was emerging from a box I hadn't even realized I had been in. "Man, it feels good to be away from the city," I cheered. "Oh yeah," Elder Morton agreed. "We haven't really been in a city," Elder Chung said. "Go to China. There you will find real cities." I grinned and looked over my shoulder. Elder Feldman had dropped back, and Elder Warren was stopped between the four of us and Elder Feldman, looking back and forth between the two. I could tell he was torn between waiting for his companion and joining the rest of us. There was one very steep pole left between us and our goal, and I decided we should probably let Elder Feldman catch up. "Let's wait a bit," I suggested, and Elders Morton, Chung, Sykes, and I paused to wait for Elder Warren and Elder Feldman. Elder Sykes laced his fingers and put his hands on his head, breathing hard. "That's a good climb," he said. "Yes, I've never done something like this," Elder Chung said. "Well, you're doing a great job," I replied. "I don't think Elder Feldman has been exercising in the mornings," Elder Chung observed. Elder Sykes and I glanced at each other, and I said, "No, I don't think so, Elder Chung." Finally, Elder Warren and Elder Feldman came up to us, with Elder Warren taking a few steps, then pausing to wait for Elder Feldman, then advancing a few more steps. When Elder Feldman reached us, he collapsed on the ground and groaned. "This sucks," he gasped. I could tell Elder Warren was starting to lose his patience, so I said, "Hey, Elder Warren, why don't you head up the group? Elder Feldman and I will be right behind you guys." Elder Warren didn't have to be told twice. He led out, scaling the steep trail with gusto. I waited for a bit, looking out over the valley below. On the other side of the train tracks, below, our cars were parked in a wide open space, and now looked like little ants gleaming in the sunlight. The sun was now high above us, glaring off the buildings of the university, and beyond them neat city blocks were laid out in a patchwork of stucco-covered buildings and asphalt. Visibility was poor, as the ever-present smog obscured my view. Nothing but the occasional palm tree interrupted the sea of civilization. I wonder what Southern California looked like before all the people came, I wondered out loud. "Don't care," Elder Feldman grunted. His chest wasn't heaving as much, and his eyes were shut against the mid-morning sunshine. "Hey, you can do this, Elder," I said encouragingly. "We just have this last pull. I can see the sea from here." A grunt from Elder Feldman. The other missionaries were already halfway up the climb, grinding steadily upward. "Ready to give it another go?" I asked. "I guess," Elder Feldman assented. He rolled onto his hands and knees and pulled himself up from the ground wearily. It was slow going, but I was determined to stick with Elder Feldman no matter how long it took. He expressed his appreciation by grunting every time I said something. I tried to lift his spirits with a story about hiking Cloud Peak back in Wyoming, but he didn't seem to appreciate it. Every 20 yards or so he would stop, hands on knees, completely winded. I would climb up ahead and then pause, waiting while he approached. Sometimes I would give him a hand up a particularly difficult part before turning to continue upward. Finally, when we were about 100 yards from the sea, the trail narrowed and scaled a rock shelf. I scrambled up, using my hands to help, then turned to observe Elder Feldman's progress. His fingers gripped the rock, and he prepared to heave himself over the shelf, his teeth gritted with exertion. Rocking back just a bit, he went to scale the rock shelf, when his foot slipped out from under him, and he slid back down the hill a few feet on his hands and knees. That did it. Elder Feldman was mad. "I'm gonna kill you, Jonesy!" he bellowed, pawing at the gravel embedded in one of his knees and dusting off his hands. "Well, you'll have to come up here to do it," I called down. A grin split his face, and he surged forward, clawing his way up the rock shelf. I reached down and grabbed his wrist, helping him up the final few feet. "All right," he chuckled. "Now I'm gonna kill you." "That would be a shame," I grinned, "because we're almost there, and I would really like to see this sea I've been looking at every day from the valley." Elder Feldman nodded, his hands on his knees. "Well, what are we waiting for?" he said. "You lead." When we came up to the sea, the 4 other missionaries were there taking pictures. It was a huge mass of concrete, and it was painted bright yellow. The graffiti wasn't too thick on it either. I whistled as Elder Feldman collapsed onto the sea at the feet of the rest of the group. I wonder how they got all this concrete up there. And then the paint? That would be a pretty good haul, I said. Elder Feldman opened a single eye and looked up at me. Jonesy, I can tell you one thing. I wouldn't have carried it up here. Must have been someone as crazy as you. Looking back, that trek up to the UCRC is still one of my favorite P-Day outings. The view wasn't much better from the top than it had been from the spot where I stayed with Elder Feldman, but I had to admit it was still beautiful in its own way. Furthermore, that climb turned out to be something of a turning point for Elder Feldman. He started exercising again and dropped about 20 pounds before returning home. As far as I know, he's a stalwart member of the U.S. Armed Forces, and he frequently shares pictures of himself on the tops of mountains. Well, there you go. An untold tale from the middle of somewhere. Living in Southern California was a big change for me. It was a huge adjustment. But we did manage to find some opportunities to get out into nature. In fact, I'm sure there's some really good hiking in Southern California. It just wasn't in our area, so we did what we could. And I'm sure that if you've served a mission, you might have some experiences with the outdoors. And if you didn't serve stateside, you probably have some really good experiences with the outdoors. And I'd like to hear about them. So be sure to comment on this post when I post it to Facebook, the episode that is, or shoot me an email. My email is untoldtalesthepodcast@gmail.com, and I'd love to hear from you. So, as always, this has been another Untold Tale from this side of nowhere, where we work twice as hard for half as much, and still find time for the important things, like fishing. See you next time, folks.